I'm Lawrence Sanford, Senior Analyst with the American Security Council Foundation, and we are delighted to have with us as our guest on our Peace Through Strength webinar, John Tamny, a noted economist who has many contrarian views that are not necessarily heard on the streets of Wall Street anymore, but I find him very informative and very knowledgeable. He's a graduate of the University of Texas with an MBA from Vanderbilt. And he's going to talk today about the economic ties between the United States and China. So, John, welcome, and please let's proceed with the webinar.
Well, first of all, big thanks to Lawrence Sanford and Tracy Steele for inviting me. It's always flattering to be asked to do things like this. And big thanks to those who are attending via webinar and everything. I really want to stress ahead of time that you are the change. You represent the change. There's a flawed assumption out there that Washington will be changed from the inside, that people will see the light. But it's more realistic to say that what happens in Washington is an effect of how viewpoints change outside of it. And so the people here who are actively influencing others, who are inviting people to this webinar, who are knocking on doors, writing op-eds, that's the change. And so I'm humbled to be before you, and I'm excited to have a discussion. As Lawrence points out, I'm a bit on the outside or on the opposite side of my views of many on China, and that's okay. What's important is that you hear me, I hear you, and we have a good and informative discussion. In talking about China in the decoupling concept, I think it's worthwhile to begin with first principles with Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, which many people are think, oh, wow, I'm going to fall asleep right away. But it really is. It's a great book. I would argue that it's one of the most unread books in the world. Lots of people have copies. Very few people have read it. They see how thick it is, how small the letters are, and they understandably run away from it. But it really is remarkable. To read it is to read about the world we live in today. And what's got to be stressed about it is Adam Smith did not invent capitalism. What The Wealth of Nations is about is him reporting on it, reporting it as practiced, not just near him in Scotland, but around the world. And what's fascinating is when you open it up, the book basically begins in a pin factory, and this is 18th century. And Smith noted how one man working alone in the pin factory could maybe produce one pin per day. But roughly 7 to 8 men working together in that pin factory in specialized fashion could produce tens of thousands of pins per day. And so it's a reminder of what I think is very true. Human beings and their arrival do not represent a job taken, or human beings working don't represent a job someone else not working. They represent people working better, more productively. The more that you can divide up the production of goods and services across a greater number of hands and machines, the more productively you're working and the better your pay is. So with work, the more people that are there, the higher your pay. And evidence supporting this claim there's lots of examples of this, but let's just go to Henry Ford in the early part of the 20th century. It cannot be stressed enough that cars, when the 20th century dawned, were an incredibly rare luxury. Only for Henry Ford to say that he wanted to make cars for the great multitude. And he did that by dividing up the work involved in creating cars. What were Ford's factories but the pin factory writ large? Thousands of people doing specialized, narrow work on a daily basis, doing what they did best, working together on the way to the mass production of cars. And so what used to be expensive became very cheap, precisely because so many men and machines were working together. And it speaks once again to the value of people. People never harm us. The more, the better. And what worked in Detroit, what worked such that wages kept going up in Detroit as more people arrived, it doesn't stop working if the people we're working with are in another country or on the other side of the world. The more that we can divide up labor, the better off we are. simply because we have much better odds of doing the work that we do best. And I think that's a good way of thinking about trade. So often people talk about open markets and trade, and they say, well, what's really great about it is the whole world is working to serve us. And yes, that's a great thing. The more people get up and go to work every day, the more we get discounts. But I think the more beautiful thing about it really is that work divided increases the odds greatly that we'll get to do the work that most associates with our unique skills and intelligence. When we're doing what we love, we're much more productive and we earn a lot more. And so it brings to mind one other thing before we get into China. Imagine if we were having this talk in 1825 instead of 2025. What first should be said is that if everyone was in the Vero Beach area, the discussion wouldn't be trade with China. It'd be, should we trade with Sebastian or Port St. Lucie? The world was a much smaller, everything was much more local back then because transportation was so primitive. And so it would have been about local trade. But the other thing that's got to be stressed about this is that in 1825, the vast majority of us, if not all of us, would have been farmers. And it speaks to how cruel the world was just 200 years ago. Mankind, just about every daily effort of mankind was directed toward one thing, the creation of food. And as evidenced by that, we've got to be reminded that Americans were awful farmers, and so was the world. That so much effort of everyone had to, 6 days a week, dawn to dusk, had to go into the creation of food. And so it's a reminder that we couldn't even have had this meeting 200 years ago because no one would have had time to take off during the day to have this kind of discussion. And what it tells me is, wow, I'm so glad to be alive right now in an interconnected world like this. And so what changed? Why am I not a farmer? Well, the tractor came about, fertilizer. You could argue that the tractor and fertilizer were the biggest job destroyers in the history of mankind, and certainly in the history of the US. Everyone was farmers, and suddenly they weren't. But that didn't put people into breadlines. It just freed people up to become doctors, lawyers, bankers, investment bankers. Henry Ford's parents were farmers. He grew up on a farm. He got to make cars. Uh, there's never a lack of jobs. There's just a lack of economic growth. The lack is always a function of people not working together, not people working together. And so nowadays, the range of ways in which we can showcase our genius in the workplace explodes by the day. There are nowadays people who quite literally make tens of thousands a month by downloading their sleep patterns on YouTube every night. That's how specialized of a world we live in. And I think that's beautiful. And it's a useful jumping off point in discussing China, I think. And in talking about China, I want to lead with something that's going to bother some will agree with, some will be indifferent to. But China is not a communist country. No doubt the political class that runs it is the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, but China is decidedly not communist. And how you firstly know that is that we're discussing whether or not to decouple our economic activity from what goes on in China. Well, if it were communist, we wouldn't be having this discussion because we would have very little coupling to speak of with a country that would be desperately poor and full of people starving. Because that is what communism is. It's when the government owns the means of production and owns the fruits of production. I look back in time to the 1970s. Well, the Soviet Union was communist for quite some time, but communism is defined by unrelenting drudgery, misery, people walking around with their heads down, shuffling around, frowns on their faces. In Russia, in Moscow, if you went into the very few restaurants that existed, you picked up menus that were decades old, and that it really didn't even matter what was on the menu. You were going to get whatever they told you you could have, and it was going to be served to you by a surly waiter who didn't want to be there. That's communism. And communism, as practiced in China, was tens of millions of people dying of starvation, of torture. Because, see, communism runs against human nature. It was an awful life. As John Lennon said in his song from the late 70s, early 80s, nobody told me they're starving back in China, so finish what you got. If he were alive today, he would change the name of the country in the song because it's not relevant anymore. The Chinese people are eating. And whatever you think about China, whether you like their government, whatever you think of the country itself, the people, I think that's something worth rejoicing. The Chinese people are eating and they're eating abundantly where they used to be starving, which is a sign that once again, they're no longer communist. They're increasingly free economically. And because they're free economically, that's why we're working with them. It's because they've moved away from the disaster that was communism that we're having this discussion today. And again, so I think in that, at the very least, I hope I can convince you that it's beautiful that human beings, and the Chinese are humans like us, are getting to eat where they formerly were not, and they were dying. From there, you've got to start asking the question, okay, so the Chinese are eating because they're increasingly free to produce. And think about why they're producing what? What are they doing that for? Well, because they want to get things. The Chinese people are free to keep the fruits of their work, and that's why they produce so much. It's fascinating to see the metamorphosis of it. In 1978, Shanghai, which is the business capital of China, was said to have 15 tall buildings. 1-5. By 2005, there are 6,780 skyscrapers in Shanghai alone. And I ask you to Google any city in China, Shenzhen, Chongqing, go down the list. They're just lit up with skyscrapers. That is not a creation of the state. That's a creation of people increasingly free to produce. And so again, it's a happy story. The transformation of China from the desperate, abject poverty that once was to where they are now is a remarkable story. And unless all of us on this call are willing to basically shed all that we've ever believed, we have to say that, wow, there's been an explosion of economic freedom in China, a movement away from communism, and evidence from it is all around us, including the fact that Americans are such big importers of so much from China. We talk about the cheap goods that come from China. Well, that's the Soviet Union didn't produce for us cheap goods. The Chinese produced for us an abundance of cheap goods. And so, as the Walmart CEO, Lawrence McMillan, said years ago in a speech, he said, every day that the Chinese get up and go to work, Americans get a raise. Well, I think that to me, that's a beautiful thing. When you look at it more specifically, to extract natural gas in the United States, that is a function of machinery and equipment that we could not make without China, without the inputs from China. When you think of NVIDIA, one of the most valuable corporations in the world, it makes chips that are transforming the world, including China, but those chips could not be made without certain inputs from China. You take something like Boeing's 747 plane that sadly is no longer with us, but that was an effect of 6 million different parts from around the world, including China. The simple truth is that you could not have these amazing airplanes without this globalized production of goods and services that China is a part of. Take the iPhone by Apple. Even if we wanted to produce that in the United States, we couldn't right now. We just don't have that kind of expertise. The iPhone is a function of global cooperation over 6 continents, including China. Without these producers around the world, without people dividing up the work of the iPhone, it wouldn't be nearly as good, and it'd be way too expensive for most any of us to own. And so again, there's a really positive thing going on whereby because the Chinese are increasingly participating in work, because they're essentially joining the proverbial pin factory, the abundance, not just in the US, but around the world is staggering. But some will say, okay, well, the Chinese are producing so much for us. They're taking advantage of us. All these cheap goods coming into the United States, they're taking advantage of us. Well, I would reject that notion. they produce things for us, and that frees us to do other things. Again, it's the pin factory, it's Henry Ford's car factory. Just because other people are working doesn't mean we're out of work. China's rise economically, let's look at it. They essentially joined the free world economically starting in the 90s. And since then, has occurred alongside some of the biggest, boomingest years for the stock market and low unemployment in American history. I don't think the two are unrelated. When suddenly you add all these people who are desperate to escape poverty into the workforce, you just improve the quality of American labor in the process. American labor is defined by low rates of unemployment. The arrival of China hasn't put Americans out of work. It's enabled Americans to do much better, higher paying work. But again, the Chinese, by all accounts, and I'm not here to dispute it, Walmart will admit it, Target will admit it, anyone will admit it, they produce a lot that comes to the United States. And so Americans get that discount that some people view as China taking advantage of us. Okay, but remember why they're doing it. The Chinese are not producing in abundance because they want to be poor. They're producing for us in abundance because they want to live like we live, which is a big difference. Never forget that whatever Xi Jinping thinks of the United States, maybe he loves us, maybe he hates us. Let's agree that he hates us. The Chinese people love the United States. And evidence supporting this claim is that arguably the biggest symbol of American-style capitalism in the world that everyone knows is McDonald's. Well, there are 5,500 McDonald's in China. McDonald's Corporation's plan is for by the year 2028, so less than 3 years from now, they expect to be up to 10,000 in China alone. Tesla sells 35% of its cars in China. When the 2025 began, there were 7,300 Starbucks in China. The plan by Starbucks by year end is to have 9,000 of them there. Is there a shoe more American than Nike? Well, China's the second largest market for Nike, and it's also a locale where a lot of Nike apparel and shoes are still made. For the longest time, GM sold more cars in China than it did in North America. Think about Apple, depending on the day, America's most valuable corporation. It sells a fifth of its iPhones in China. And so what this is a reminder of is that as the Chinese have begun to produce abundantly for the American market, they've spent the fruits of that production ravenously on American goods and service. They love it. They like the quality of them. America represents freedom and high quality, and they want it. To visit China is not just to be awed by all the skyscrapers. It's to be awed by the fact that everywhere you look is an American business and a sign for an American business. To be in China is to be more welcome as an English-speaking American than realistically anyone else there, including the Chinese. Everything that you're used to, the vast majority of the comforts that you're used to in the United States can be had in China. This is a people that wants to emulate us. They want to live like us, and they're working hard to do it. And I think that's a beautiful thing. But again, and then I will add, okay, so, but the view is, well, China is a bad country. It's got bad people running it. I'm not going to argue with that. I don't like politicians in general, so I'm not going to argue with that. But I would say, based on that, what could be better than all this exchange between the productive in each country? Because the simple truth is that there is no foreign policy that mankind has ever conceived of that's better and more peaceful than trade. People will say that China is taking advantage of us and they are reliant on the US economy. They are. Without US production, if the US economy were to implode tomorrow, China would be incredibly desperate. It would be in incredibly desperate straits. But by the same token, if China were to implode tomorrow, if it were to re-embrace communism, oh my gosh, the US economy would be in awful shape. the US stock markets would be not just down, but 1929 times many exponents down. So much of our growth is rooted in what happens in China. But see, that's a good thing. I mean, honestly, anyone on this call right now, have you ever wanted to kill your best customer? Have you ever wanted to bomb your best customer? Have you ever wished misfortune on your best customer? No. And that's not, as JFK, as John F. Kennedy's father used to say to him, son, war is bad for business. Don't get into it. Avoid it. Avoid it all the time. And that's not to say that war will never happen between the United States and China. Who knows? The future is unknowable. But it is to say that war between China and the United States is much less likely the more we're trading with each other. Because the more we're trading with each other, the more our fortune is tied to theirs and vice versa, such that war would be the last thing that anyone would want to engage in because it would be just so economically crippling. It would be disastrous for both countries. But people will still say, not understandably, but wait a second, we need to be prepared. We need to have a military that can protect us if the unthinkable or the thinkable, however you want to view it, happens. I'm not arguing with that. I'm not anti-military. But what I will argue with you there is that if the aim is having the strongest military possible on the off chance that China becomes a battlefield enemy, let's grow our economy as much as possible until then. And the best way to grow it is to keep trading lanes open between the US and China, simply because governments can't build militaries, and you can't have a strong military if you don't have a strong economy. And that's what I think a lot of people forget, that the people who most knew the Soviet Union wasn't a threat back in the 60s and 70s were people who'd visited the Soviet Union. It was communist, which meant it was a disaster. They had no economy to fight a war with the United States. They quite simply lacked the means. And so if we are to defend ourselves, we want to be trading with potential enemies so that war is a much less likely outcome. But if it is, we want to be as economically prepared as possible. We want to be as big economically as possible so that we can fund the kind of military that could most capably defend. And so in thinking about this notion of decoupling, to state that it would be an awful idea is just, it's almost a waste of words. The US and China are so economically interconnected. To decouple, it's hard to know where to begin, how economically devastating that would be for all around, which explains why it's never going to happen, I don't think. And it's not going to happen for the reason that just described. We are so interconnected, and both countries are so advantaged by that economically. To reverse that would bring on the mother of stock market crashes that would once again make 1929 and 1987 appear really tame by comparison. And so I doubt it's going to happen. And then I'll just say, why would we want it to happen? Again, if we ignore the fact that the Chinese are just conducting a passionate love affair with all things American, what's to be gained from this? We say there's a threat from China. Well, the CCP can't even convince its people to despise the United States. So why would we try to do what the CCPC can't do with these constant tariffs and insults of China? Oh, they're stealing from us. They're doing this. They're doing that. Why would we ever do that? The Chinese people venerate us in the same way that the Soviet people venerated us. If you look back to the opening of McDonald's in Red Square, however many years ago, the first day of it, 30,000 Soviets showed up. 30,000. They'd been hearing propaganda for decades about how awful the United States was, yet they knew better. And the Chinese people know better today. Why would we ever try to reverse what has been so good for both countries but that by extension has been so good for humanity more broadly. Once again, the Chinese were formerly starving. Now they're not. Let's not be a part of a movement that could cause them the economic desperation they once had to suffer and that would bring us enormous amounts here. And so I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Oops, you're on mute, Larry.
John,
There
Yeah, I
you
think
go.
John, I agree with most of your comments, but I would add that the CCP is the problem. I lived in Hong Kong for 2 years, and I really respected and liked the entrepreneurial culture of the Chinese. They're hardworking, intelligent, and they're very much capitalist in mindset. So I agree with you 100%. And the fact that they're kicked off communism and they've really become what I would call a fascist state. That the economic freedoms are there, but the government, the CCP, is declaring unrestricted warfare against the United States, and they're using their economic clout to basically uh, try to install their domination of the world. And I don't think I'd so easily discount their billions of dollars worth of intellectual theft from what they've done to the United States. I don't think I discount the fentanyl poisoning of American culture. I don't think I discount the TikToks of the world. And reciprocity is one of American security's uh, founding principles. And the fact that the United States can't reciprocate with China in so many areas, free press, TikToks of the world can operate in America, but American social media can't operate in China. And yes, I would agree that the Chinese are fond of Americans in broad, but I would also say that the Chinese are very fond of themselves even more. And the CCP is indoctrinating the citizens as a world-class surveillance system of control. So, and they're expanding in the South China Sea. Look what they've done in Tibet and Xinjiang, so Hong Kong for that matter, and they're threatening war against Taiwan. And Taiwan has never been part of Chinese communist China. They've been part of China, but not the CCP controlled China. So there's all sorts of warning signs about the Chinese being an existential threat to the United States. So I'm all with you. In fact, the trade is good, but if you have a political party such as the CCP whose intent is to harm America, then we have a problem.
Well, let's start with TikTok. Um, if the Chinese don't want to, if they want to injure their people by not letting them enjoy our social media, why would we mimic that? That makes us like the CCP. So I don't want to do that. I would also say it's not very effective.
But I would
Again,
argue that the
the, the
CCP,
the CCP seemingly is if they're conducting warfare against the United States, that would presumably include propaganda that's been an abject failure. The Chinese people love everything about the United States, and they want to go to school here, and they want our businesses, and so that gets to I hear all the time how it's going very fascist, which I find interesting as we in this country suddenly, as taxpayers, I guess, own Intel and U.S. Steel and 15% of NVIDIA's profits or percentage of what they sell over there. I find that kind of rich while wondering, I hear this all the time, but are markets stupid? You see, I trust McDonald's much more than I trust the experts in the US who say that China's moving away from economic freedom. McDonald's wouldn't be expanding like that if the country were moving away from it. And it wouldn't be so important for NVIDIA to be in China. Again, that's one of our most valuable corporations. If they didn't see opportunity that the experts don't see. And I can find just thousands and thousands of academics and experts who say China's moving away from free markets. what I find fascinating is I can never find a business that feels that way because they want to keep expanding there. I trust business more than I trust markets. And I also trust it because if in fact the Chinese do have negative plans for the world and for us, it's going to be much tougher to pull off the more that we're economically integrated.
Points taken. Thank you, John. Do we have any comments, Tracy, from anyone else who would like to have any questions at all?
Hey, Larry, I've got my hand up.
Okay, Steve.
Hey, thank you, John. I appreciate your comments there, and let me start where I agree with you. I do agree that positive economic growth is a good thing, and has been for the past 100 years through all the industrialization. Where I disagree with you, and Larry hit a lot of the points, is you state that the Chinese people don't hate the United States, and I fully agree with that. However, the government is not so loving towards the United States, and you can go right down the list of all the bad actors out there. You can talk about Hamas in Gaza. You can talk about the mullahs in Iran. You can talk about the oligarchy and Putin in Russia. But I think where your argument breaks down is it's those that control the levers of power, the economic, the social, the political, the military, steer the ship of state. And if they're steering it towards conflict with the United States, I have no argument with the Chinese people. I probably have more in common with them than a lot of others. If the powers that be, the powers of state, are in conflict, then you have a conflict. And you say that the Soviets loved, not the Soviets, the Russian people loved the United States, but the Soviet Union launched just a juggernaut against the Nazis in World War II. I don't know where the love broke down there, but that's where conflict comes from. So I just offer that to you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Yeah, a lot of I just generally don't trust politicians in general. But I don't. What you're saying wouldn't compel me to pull away from from the freedom for Americans to engage with China. I would say once again, if in fact the Chinese government has plans for us that are anything but peaceful, it's going to be a lot more difficult to do if we're economically integrated with them. And I hear all the time about war in the future, war in the future. But if it were true, again, I don't think US businesses would be so rapidly expanding in China. I'm not saying they know everything, but I think markets are wise. I don't think there'd be the finance there for that. I think sometimes we as Americans think that we need to be involved everywhere in ways that maybe aren't so good for everywhere. Ask yourself the question, what if Putin or Xi or whatever, what if Russia says today, oh yeah, we're going to pull out of Ukraine, but yeah, we just worked out a deal with President Sheinbaum in Mexico. We in China, we're gonna put some bases there because we just, we're concerned about that part of the world. America has throughout history expanded in certain places. Americans wouldn't accept that. And again, yet when any other country presumes to defend itself, we Americans look askance at it. We lost how many on 9/11? A tragedy. But Russia lost 28 million in World War II. Are they not allowed to defend themselves? I'm sure some here have read the book, The Rape of Nanking, and about the unspeakable horrors that the Japanese foisted on the Chinese. To read it is to be so revolted. I would not read it on air. So the Chinese can't defend themselves. And especially with us close by over there, when we were in Afghanistan, what were we, 600 miles from China? Again, Look, I'm not some pinko. My dad's a Naval Academy grad. His older brother is Naval Academy grad. His father was Naval Academy grad. I'm from a military family, but I find it really disturbing that any other country that presumes to defend itself is up to no good. But we have troops around the world.
Yeah, John, I just add to that those troops around the world have kept the peace for a number of years. You talk about China China taking over Taiwan. Is that a peaceful pursuit?
You know what? We're not going to know. I will point out to you there that, okay, Taiwan Semiconductor, uh, the creation of the chips in Taiwan is so intricate that if a bomb were ever dropped on Taiwan, anywhere, it would shut down TSMC like that. And the impact for the global economy would be staggeringly awful, and it would be awful for China. I don't know, but at this point, I'll say this. Look, I'm an economics guy. I'm not an economist, but I'm an economics guy. All I can say is if you think that I should trust American foreign policy experts anymore, you're dreaming. But you see, to me, government is awful domestically. It makes mistake after
Violent
mistake.
agreement there, John.
Okay, and so but then we say anytime the same people in government who want to lead global military style things, well, suddenly that's noble and good and it's right. I don't know about that. And I would just say, look, we can't know because the US is always involved everywhere. But there's enormous amounts of cross-border investment from the mainland into Taiwan. There's enormous amounts of investment from Taiwan into the mainland. What if the US were to say, we don't have a dog in this fight? I'm going to guess, and you can say I'm naive, but I would say to you that American foreign policy for all of my life has been incredibly naive with devastating consequences for young Americans. I'll say that if we would stay out, that probably the eventual reunification would be bloodless for the same reason that I want to have trade with China and between China and the United States. It would be too costly for China and the Taiwanese to go to war. But again, we don't know, and so it's easy to look and say this guy is nuts. But again, how have the experts done for you on foreign policy in modern times?
Well, I was in the military, and I'll tell you, they didn't do very well.
Yeah.
But still, but
the
John,
State Department really did badly, and they keep doing badly. And so again, I don't know, but boy, there's a lot of wealth tied up in an eventual peaceful reunification between the two.
yeah, and John, that goes back to my comment there that those that control the lever of power, the politicians, the leaders of those countries, they're the ones steering the ship of state. And that's where they go. The Russian people, no doubt, love us, but still, Putin was able to invade Ukraine. Do the Ukrainians have the right to defend themselves? Of course they do. Do the Russians have the right to defend themselves? Of course they do. But when you start crossing those boundaries and getting ready to slug it out, I think that's where the argument breaks down.
Well,
yeah, it's a tough question.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you, Steve. Any other comments from anyone? Well, with that, I bid you adieu. Thank you very much, John. I enjoyed the conversation, very insightful. And on behalf of the American Security Council Foundation, I thank you, and visit our website at www.ascf.us. And again, thank you. Good day.